Okay, so we are live. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the 20th edition of the Online Education Leadership Forum, focused on transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. Thank you so much for investing your time with us on a weekday. My name is Aryan Salman. I am the moderator for this panel discussion. The topic of our 20th educational leadership is the role and influence of neuroscience in education. Over the past several decades, neuroscience has expanded both as a field of study and as a field of application in education. Integrating neuroscience with education has great potential to enhance learner competencies and abilities while advancing global citizenship and sustainable development. If done wrong, it can be detrimental. While researchers and academics attempt to ascertain the most effective methods of teaching and learning various subjects and incorporate evidence-informed interventions in both teaching and learning, it is imperative for us to create awareness amongst practitioners to translate these transdisciplinary insights into learning and teaching into impactful school and classroom interventions. We are very hopeful that this discussion contributes to our core mission of transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. That being said, I take immense pleasure in welcoming Mr. Craig Fullerton. Mr. Fullerton is considered the inspirational thought leader in integral education. The media refers to Craig, the expert keynote speaker in education with over 2 decades of experience across the world as an education leader, teacher, consultant, best-selling author, and TED speaker. He consults coaches, mentors, educational leadership teams, teachers, and students in China and the Asia Pacific. Craig continues to be based across Australia and the Asia Pacific region. He is currently based in Hong Kong, working with Independent Schools Foundation Academy. Welcome to you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Yeah, and we also have with us Professor Michael Thomas. It's my immense pleasure to welcome you. Professor Thomas is the director of University of London Centre for Educational Neuroscience and is a professor of cognitive neuroscience at Birkbeck University of London. He is the co-author of the recent book, Educational Neuroscience, Development Across the Lifespan, published by Routledge. And he's coming up with another book, The Educational Neuroscience, The Basics. He's a chartered psychologist, fellow of the British Psychological Society, fellow of the US Association of Psychological Science, and senior fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. As we continue to live in an increasingly challenging and uncertain time with enormous changes and disruptions to our life and our professions, it is a moment for us to assume active global citizenship and support those in need. Having said that, I would like to take this moment to mark a minute of silence for those who have lost their lives to the pandemic, the grieving individuals and families, and in solidarity with academics and education leaders in conflict zones, including Ukraine, Yemen, Afghanistan, and other conflict and war-affected areas around the world. Now we ring the bell to thank and honor our educators and others on the front line who carry out essential roles selflessly, continuing their day-to-day duties inside and outside the home in support of us all. Your struggle and commitment for a better future for all inspires us. Thank you. Now, the Educational Leadership Forum was started with a mission to provide for leaders to shape, empower, influence, and advance the discourse on, and be a springboard aiding action towards transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. Through the Educational Leadership Forum series, Global Citizenship Foundation and the Council for Global Citizenship Education are committed to supporting educational leaders and educators by connecting experts, practitioners, and global education leaders from across the world to discuss and share critical and innovative ideas, best practices, and perspectives aimed at transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. So today is, whatever your role is in the education sector, you will come away with something a new idea, a fresh perspective, a new strategy that you can apply to be more successful at what you're doing best while ensuring the much needed continuous professional development required to transform education for human and planetary flourishing. Now, here's a special message to all the attendees before I yield the floor to the panelists. So, during the discussion, you can engage in three ways. First, you can engage in reactions. So, there's a reaction button out here, there's an emoji that you can click on, and I'm just showing you. So, this is how it appears. So, you can react with those emojis. The second way of engaging is using the chat section and engaging in the chat conversation. And the third way is to ask your questions in the Q&A option. So you'd see on the right side, the Q&A button, you click on it and type in your questions. So that's how we can engage and keep it lively. So I open the floor to the panel discussion by requesting Professor Michael Thomas to make his initial remarks.
Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me okay. Okay, so I'm going to start off talking from the research point of view. As you'll get from my introduction, I'm the director of a university research center. The research center I run is the Center for Educational Neuroscience, which involves around a dozen academics from different parts of the University of London. So our focus is threefold: carrying out cognitive neuroscience research in skills that are relevant to education. Then there's trying to think about specific ways to translate research findings into the classroom. And finally, to build a dialogue with educators and policymakers to ensure translation is as much guided by the needs of practitioners as the scientific findings. So I'm delighted the Educational Leadership Forum is considering the role of neuroscience in education, as you'd expect, given that's my specialism. But I regret it would take longer than 5 minutes to cover the current and possible contributions of neuroscience to education. But the basic idea is simple. Since the emergence of neuroimaging in the 1990s, we now know a lot more about the brain mechanisms of learning. Surely some of this information can be useful for teachers in the classroom. And this is the field of educational neuroscience. Now, progress hasn't always been smooth. We've faced three main problems in our history so far. One of them, miscommunication of the scientific findings. These are the so-called neuromyths, such that we only use 10% of our brains. Not true. Then there's a second problem with early overreach. That is, there was influence on policy making that was at the time ahead of what we knew in the science, such as around early years education in the US in the 1990s. And thirdly, commercial exploitation. That is, companies advancing brain training products and making claims which weren't supported by the science. I think the field is doing better now with better communication and more caution about the research, such as a greater reliance on randomized controlled trials. The policy climate has also advanced. For example, UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development recently issued a report into the future of global education. It was entitled Reimagining Education, the International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment. And it emphasized both how education should take a whole brain, learner-centric approach towards learning, and also how progress in education should rely on multidisciplinary dialogue. In addition to global policy, in individual countries, institutions have been set up to accumulate an evidence base of what works and what doesn't work in education, such as the What Works Clearinghouse in the US and the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK. So, how should neuroscience influence education? There are two main routes, either indirectly via improving our psychological theories of learning, or directly by helping us understand the factors that influence brain plasticity, factors such as diet, sleep, fitness, and stress levels. These are, of course, only person level factors, and they must be seen in the wider context of family factors, school factors, social and policy dimensions of education. Education is not just about the brain. Does knowing how the brain works help teaching? Well, I wouldn't say teachers and instructors need a detailed understanding of brain function. But let me give you an example of what I think they should know, an example of the level at which they should understand brain function. So, based on its evolutionary history, classroom learning would only be the brain's fourth most important priority. The most important priority for the brain is movement, making the right action given your perceptual input. The second most important priority for the brain is emotions. These are a sort of deep programming from evolution to ensure our survival. The third priority, as social primates, is other people. Many areas of the brain are concerned with what other people around you are doing right now and what they think of you and what you think of them. Only after that, because the sort of cognition we are seeking to influence in the classroom, such as literacy and numeracy. A lesson you would draw from this is that in classroom activities, you need to align the brain's first three most important priorities, sensory motor, emotions, social, with the fourth priority of learning so that they support learning outcomes and don't interfere with learning. So we have a number of projects underway in my research center. Just a very brief flavor. We are developing a computer-based learning activity to help primary age children learn counterintuitive concepts in maths and science. We're investigating the role of mobile phone use in adolescent mental health, cognitive development, and educational achievement. And we're investigating how to improve the success of adult literacy programs in low-income countries based on principles of brain plasticity. I'll finish with the two major challenges that I think educational neuroscience is facing. That's aside from the complexity of the brain itself. Obviously, the research is hard. The brain is complicated. The first is establishing the details of translation from research to produce principles and practices that will work for teachers, that teachers both can use, have the time to use, and want to use in the classroom. And the second is how teacher training should be altered over time to include some understanding of the mechanisms of learning and the importance of research. I'll finish there, and many thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Michael. So it's lovely to hear you. So I yield the floor to you, Mr. Craig Fullerton.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining. And thank you, Michael, for that really great introduction to what you're doing in your institute. That's great. What we're looking at from the learning and teaching perspective, which will be the angle that I'll come from this evening, in taking a lot of not just things that Michael mentioned, but also things that are relevant to increasing a few things: intrinsic motivation of students, the emotional investment of students, which of course lead to enjoyment of content, recall of content, and a more holistic approach to learning. My background is in education, as it was presented earlier by Arian, thank you. And my research background is also based around the exciting area of developing neuroeducation, we call it. And it's neuroscience and education. But in the past, the research of neuroscience has kind of been there, and education research has been there, and cognitive psych has been there, and associative learning's been here, and NLP's been here, and all of those things. And what I do with integral education is to bring the best of all those together to develop a model of learning and teaching which really engages students, motivates students, and has this emotional investment for students. Because young people, if we think about it, they are very emotionally invested. They are really looking for things that will stimulate their thinking, things that will engage them. Social media is an example. I mean, if you take a student that a young person, teenager or otherwise, and you talk to them about social media, there's a like, there's a hit, there's another like, there's another hit. Why? Because each of those areas is engaging them, stimulating them into wanting to learn more about the story, let's say. Now, if we can take that basic idea into the classroom and using one of the oldest formats in the world of learning and teaching, right back to Socratic times of master-student, by telling stories as one example. There's many more, but the students can then really, really engage, and we incorporate different aspects of teaching and learning, incorporating different aspects to stimulate the mind, the brain, to get that emotional investment, to get that imagination working, and so on. It's interesting because I talked about neuroeducation, and it's a growing area. It's an area that is exciting, and I love doing research in that. I'm working on my own doctorate right now on ways of changing, looking at different ways of learning and teaching, which can really help you as educators have fun with what you do, but also have the students have fun and be really, really engaged. And that is something that is very, very new, based on the neuroscience research. And I'm working with the Institute of Organisational Neuroscience in Australia, coming out of Queensland, and also with my doctorate work researching in lots of different schools and different universities about how and why different ways that they are incorporating neuroscience or not in their teaching and learning. It's funny because here we are in 2022, and way back in 2013, some of you may have come across a book called The Brain Changed Itself. It was written by Norman Doig, MD, and he actually, in that book, he mentions not neuroeducation, it kind of came later, he mentions a term called neuroplastician. And it's like, okay, that's another term. But he uses that term to describe teachers because he believes they can quite literally change the brain. So where I'm coming from is how we can implement the neuroscience research, the neuroscience discoveries in engagement, emotional investment, imagination, all these things that we already have, that students already have, into learning and teaching, whether it be mathematics, whether it be arts, whether it be psychology, or whatever it is, just to engage those students and give them an awesome time of learning and finding a whole new way of learning as we move forward in education. And research continues to go forward with this about how we suddenly react to things like the brain being a very visual organ, if you like. So we're watching things, we like visual stimuli. Think of that Facebook example or Instagram that I learned earlier. It's not that the students are after necessarily what he's doing, what she's doing, but every click is a new story. Every click is a new emotional investment. Every click is a new exciting thing. So why not incorporate that in our planning of learning and teaching curriculum? I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and ideas. Now we move on to a round where Professor Thomas would ask a question to Mr. Fullerton, and Mr. Fullerton can ask one question to Professor Thomas. So, yeah, so we'll go with Professor Thomas.
All right, so this is kind of a selfish question from my point of view. So it is the big challenge that if you're going to use these techniques in as a teacher in the classroom with your pupils, you can just take some tips, right? That the neuroscience researchers have figured out how it works, and here's the stuff you should do, right? And they have the understanding about how the brain works. So I'm interested whether the translation from neuroscience is a set of top tips, or whether you think that the instructors, teachers should know something about how the brain works, about neuroscience, and if so, what do you think that is?
Thanks for the question, Michael. It's really a great question. It's almost like I emailed you first, which I didn't, folks. I didn't really. Thumbs up. I mean, obviously, I'm passionate about neuroscience and how learning about neuroscience can really assist teachers in knowing how the brain learns, and therefore in their planning to be able to really, really develop curriculum within the curriculum syllabus, education leaders, if we go to the admin side, to really engage students and engage others in empowering the minds that they already have to really get optimum learning in a holistic space. And having, there's many years ago, there was this new exciting, it was very good, don't get me wrong, very new exciting innovation in education. It was called flipped and blended learning. And it was like, oh, okay, well, rather than just teaching content like a postman delivering the mail, which is very much here it is, here it is, here it is, you take it away and you learn it. It was like, okay, let's change this up. Let's use multimedia. Let's say to a student, all right, here's what we've done in content today. Now go home, watch this video and come back and we'll talk about it. Or here's what we've done today. Go home, read chapter 1 and we'll talk about it tomorrow. Now, all of those methodologies are all very relevant and over the years, but let's take it from another way. Let's take it from the way the brain learns. The brain loves questions. The brain wants to know what it's looking for. So let's take that example I just used. Role play again. Okay, today I'd like you to go home and read chapter 4 of this textbook, whatever it is. That's okay. I'd like you also to watch this video that addresses some of the issues in this chapter. And I'd also like you students to consider these 2 questions as you read this chapter and come up with some dot points and then come back and we'll unpack those and we'll talk about those. Doesn't take any more time. It's more engaging and moreover, it empowers students and empowers students' minds to take responsibility and take control of their own learning rather than just be a person that is delivered curriculum from a postman. So if you have a chance, an opportunity, I encourage you. The brain is an amazing thing. It loves to be stimulated, obviously. It loves to be emotionally invested. It loves to be able to use its imagination from all these wonderful things that it's experienced over the years. Enjoy that and use that. Incorporate that into your teaching because neuroscience and education is incredibly fun and there's so much in it, but it doesn't, I'll just finish with this, Michael, and that is that to tell educators out there, don't think of it as being, oh, it's all scientific and it's all this and it's all neurotransmitters and synapses and amygdalas and all those. Yeah, it is. But for your point of view, practically, think about how the mind works. Think about how the brain learns and incorporate that into how you plan your lessons. And it'll be awesome. My response.
Great. Excellent answer. I've written that all down.
Good on you. Thank you so much.
Okay. I think you can ask a question to Professor Thomas.
Surely. Can I flip that over, Professor Thomas? And that is that of all of the neuroscience, let's say PD or professional developments or courses or degrees, or, I mean, I've chosen to do postgrad, other people haven't. What would you suggest as a great, let's say, apprenticeship for teachers to learn, to look at, to get this idea that we're passionate about to help them in the initial phases of saying, okay, this is pretty cool. What Craig and Professor Michael has said, yeah, I want to go off and I want to have a look at some of this. Where would be a great starting point for teachers and educators to go?
All right. Again, excellent question. I'm glad that the email got through. I think I have to distinguish between where we are now and some kind of vision about where we might want to get to. So right now, what concerns teachers, generally it's workload. They're really stressed, they're really busy. Second, what will you say? Funding. They haven't got enough funding. Third, if there's a major concern they have that's making their life difficult in the classroom, that's pupil behavior, student behavior, right? The minority disrupting what's going on in the classroom. And then we're saying, oh, you need to know some more stuff about neuroscience, about how the brain works. And they're thinking, how am I going to fit that in? That seems really difficult. I just want to get on. I'm so busy as it is. So that's the kind of reality of now, and we have to think about getting messages about what might help from a neuroscience point of view into continuing professional development, the kind of development activities that will be supported by their employers and fitted into their current workload model. And that requires that messages are really quite boiled down, so that it needs communicators such as yourself to get engaged with the neuroscience and find ways to simplify that and put it in terms that are most relevant. Now, I am not a big fan of top tips for teachers. And the reason for that is I think ultimately they are disempowering. That there is no principle we can ever give about what's going to work that will work for all kids in all contexts. And so if teachers take some tip, or you're supposed to repeat material 3 times, let's say, with gaps in between, the teachers will find sometimes that doesn't work and they don't have time for it. And then they'll think, oh, these tips are useless. These guys don't know what they're talking about. And they'll move on. So that's kind of prescriptive approach. You just give the tip. I think ultimately that undermines the enterprise. I think teachers need a bit of a gist about why techniques work, something about the mechanism, and that will empower them to figure out how they can adjust it for the particular children in front of them, for the particular context, the country they're in, whether they're primary or secondary, how to take techniques and couch them in local contexts. So I think you do need a bit of an understanding about why techniques work in order to use them flexibly. But that's kind of the now, and then you might want to think about the future going forward, and that's much more about teacher training, about starting from the outset. We do have in the UK that the government has kind of put together a syllabus about what they think teachers should find out about in their initial training. And some of that now is about the science of learning, particularly focusing on memory and limitations to working memory. And as you say, the active engagement, the importance of motivation for children to actually memorize any of the content that they come across. So that's part of teacher training. My ambition would also be that teachers are open to the importance of evidence and research. If you think about, sometimes educators will hear about neuroscientists and think about, oh, who are these scientists telling us what to do in the classroom? But have they ever had 36-year-olds in front of them who they have to get changed into PE kit? I mean, do these guys know anything? And that's kind of viewing neuroscience as threatening. But I would think much more about, if you think about your family doctor, these are professionals who have some medical training about how the body works. They have some kind of science training, but nevertheless, they're working with patients. They have kind of social engagement and so forth. It's not depersonalized. It's not you're not using science to reduce what's happening. But medicine has this massive research and development industry supporting it, which is about trying to come up with new treatments that may make the doctor's job easier, right? It's not reducing health. It's not reducing patients in any sense. It's trying to come up with more stuff that will work. And I don't think doctors are defensive about the research and development industry. They kind of understand the role of research, and they understand the importance of an evidence base. So that will be my kind of near and far response to that question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we move on to the moderators round. So my first question to both of you is, what is that one amazing discovery you folks have encountered in neuroscience that could perhaps change the way educators perceive neuroscience? or even otherwise, like, just one amazing discovery that you have encountered.
If I may jump in there.
Go ahead.
The one amazing, or not the one, it's a bit hard, Arian, to come up with one, but it's okay. I'll work with you. One amazing thing is giving empowerment as an educator, giving empowerment back to the student. They know what works for them. They know what ticks for them. They know what is going to work for the way that their mind works. That student could be 12 years old. That student could be 22. It could be an adult student. But they know. And what is exciting about neuroscience is that it's encouraging. A neuroscience approach to learning, or neuroeducation, as I called it there earlier, is it's empowering those students to say, hey, it's okay to use your imagination. It's okay to step outside the subject area and think about other things that might help you. It's okay to love what your mind is telling you. Self-talk, positive images, positive things that come about to help them learn. At the end of the day, as educators in the audience there, we're in the business of helping them learn. We're not in the business of telling them how to learn. I'll say that again. We're in the business of empowering them and helping them to be intrinsically motivated to learn, not extrinsically motivated. Now, what do I mean by the two of them? Fairly straightforward. It's extrinsic motivation for a student might be, I'm very much involved in the IB world, as I'm sure many of you are. The intrinsic motivation might be, what do I need to do to get a 7? I might not enjoy it. I might not have fun with it. I might not be engaged with it. But what do I need to do to get a 7? Now, you flip that completely and say, you know what? How do you want to learn? Why do you want to learn? What excites you? What presses your buttons? What empowers you as a learner? And there's many terms, of course, in education. There's differentiation, there's this and that, and they're all very valid terms, and we use them in our classrooms. But what is it that empowers you to want to learn? And then it's like, oh, well, hold on. If I'm empowered and I'm excited and I'm emotionally invested and I'm intrinsically motivated, I'll probably get that 7 anyway. Boom, there it is, because it's coming from them. They are in control of their learning with guidance by their teacher. Let me change that term. Guidance by their facilitator of learning. The teacher's facilitating that learning, so the student is empowered to learn. It's not about the extrinsic motivation. It's not about the grade. It's not about this. It's not about that. Relevant in the system we have called schools or universities, but give them the control. Help them, encourage them, using neuroscience and using the knowledge of how the brain learns. Give them the power to facilitate their own learning. I think that would be where I would leave that thought. And it's such an exciting paradigm shift for students because they know. If you chat with them, they will know. So let's stop being postmen. Here it is, learn this, learn this, learn this. Why? Why do I want to learn this? Well, we know why, but they might not know why. Empower them. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much. So, Professor Thomas.
So we're looking for one amazing discovery. Is that from neuroscience?
Yeah, from neuroscience.
Okay. So I'm going to sort of pour some cold water on that question to start off with. I don't think that's how you should view the contribution of neuroscience to education. That it's going to discover groundbreaking things. It's going to tell teachers everything that they've been doing is all wrong. I don't think it's like that. I think, this is what we find in large-scale randomized control trials We've run one on our we have a computer activity to improve kids' learning of counterintuitive concepts in like science. So kids grow up playing football on flat pitches, and then all of a sudden the science teacher tells them the world is round, and they're supposed to learn that, but then not go out and play football in any different way. Okay, so that's kind of counterintuitive. It's against what they understand. And so we've got an activity that suggests part of what kids need to do is suppress or inhibit their intuitive knowledge. And we've got a computer game that trains them in that. And we can show that game has good transfer to their end of term science exam. So we run a big randomized control trial on that. 6,000 kids, okay, and we find out we have control groups and it's randomized and all this kind of stuff, and we find out that it does work, but it has a small effect. It's a couple of months of educational advance for like about 20 hours of instruction, right? So it's an effect, it's reliable, it works, but it's small. That tends to be what you find, is that all individual techniques only have small effects. And really, we're not going to find some groundbreaking thing outside of people who've been in really deprived environments where you get rid of the big barriers holding them back. Generally, if we're going to improve educational outcomes, it will be the accumulation of many small effects. Okay, and many of the effects that we're trying to improve are stuff that teachers already know kind of works, right? I mean, Craig will agree, teachers already know motivation's important. They don't like to have bored faces looking at them. They just struggle to find ways to engage the kids, right? But the point here is, what is the contribution of neuroscience? It's not a revolution, but just because we have something that we know already works doesn't mean we can't improve it by understanding how it works. So, 400 years ago, we knew that chewing the bark of the cinchona tree helped for malaria. When people have malaria, we don't still give them the bark of the cinchona tree to chew. We have drugs with quinine in them, and we know the dosage, and we know variants of how it works and what are alternative treatments if you've got allergies and all these kind of things. And that's because we did the basic science to understand why the original effect worked. So part of what we're looking at is if you understand mechanism, you can enhance those things that we already think teachers know are effective. The last thing, I don't want to scoot away and say there are no revolutions, right? So I would say part of the contribution of neuroscience from the early 2000s onwards, we used to think that children's intelligence was stable by about age 10. That it could vary in childhood, but it's sort of stabilized. And we thought most of the brain developments pretty well happened. Brain imaging was able to look at the structure and activation through the adolescent years and into early adulthood and see that there are still continuing changes going on there. And some of them are quite marked. So it's very sort of discontinuous. And it's given us this perspective that the cognitive development is not just over by the time that the kids are age 10, but there are particular things going on in the adolescent brain. In some senses, the adolescent brain is in tip-top condition to learn new complex types of reasoning, which is exactly what you want for the more complex topics they'll be looking at that period in their education. But we also know that there are big changes in the reward systems, with a much elevated importance of what other people think of you, of peers, and less interest in what your parents think, more about trying to impress your friends, but also at that same time, not very good decision making around risk. So if you put teenagers in situations where they can do a stupid thing to impress their friends, they're much more likely to do it. Now, this is just part of juvenile behavior you find across like social primates, right? This is leaving the protection of your parents to kind of fight for your position in life. So you stop liking your parents and you're more bothered about your friends. It's completely natural, right? But as we get insights into these mechanisms, we realize how you can translate that into an educational situation, that you can elevate the importance of pro-social behavior and peer support and group work, all these things that are engaging peers with each other to sort of bolster educational outcomes by taking advantage of the interest of adolescents. So, it's not like we didn't know that the teenage years were important beforehand, but the neuroscience is helping us to understand in a little more detail about the mechanisms and think through about how that translates into educational techniques.
Thank you so much, Professor Thomas. So my next question has to do with something that Professor Thomas spoke about in his initial remarks, neuromarketing, because I'm sure a lot of educators out here might have encountered one ad or maybe one company reaching out to you and saying that it's science backed or bring science backed. So Professor Thomas, how do you? How do you know when something something is premature implementation of, say, neuroscience insights? So how would one get to know as an educator? Because for us from the outside, if you have not done research, we might not know fully, and we just go by the stamp that goes in saying, "Oh, it's neuroscience backed." So I think either of you can answer, or both of you can answer. I can give some time on this one. So how can teachers avoid that, or especially school leaders, avoid bringing such programs to their schools in case they find it a bit dicey?
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge. They even discuss this as there's a different version of this within research itself. There's an effect that some people have labeled the seductive allure of neuroscience. That if you've got some educational technique, the instructional technique that you think is good, if you put a brain image next to it, people are more likely to believe that's real. Now, these are sort of framing effects. They're kind of advertising effects. And they don't have any bearing on what I'm trying to do in translating research. I think a little bit of this is a bit like my kids come up with some fact that they've seen on the internet, and how do we know whether that fact is true? The Earth is going to be hit by a big asteroid. They've just read it, Daddy. I've just seen this on the internet. Part of this is how can we tell whether that's true? Is the source we're getting it from authoritative? Is there published research in journals that supports it? Is that research just on a related theme, or is it actually a randomized control trial with a control group, double-blind tested, not run by the people who are peddling whatever it is they're selling it, that shows evidence in support? Now, that's quite hard for the average teacher to do. They haven't got time, right? And they don't know how to read. It takes years to be able to read a science paper relatively quickly to see what the main parts of it are. That's why it's important to establish these organizations like the Education Endowment Foundation, the What Works Clearinghouse, where those guys try and compile the evidence. So if you take the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, they actually have a toolkit that lists all the techniques, having an extra teaching assistant in your room. Is that effective? Is it cost effective? What is the educational progress? If you use phonics versus the whole word approach for reading, is that effective? What is the evidence base? How much does it cost on the different programs and so forth? So appealing to going to the website of those authoritative sources to see what the evidence base is, I guess is the quickest shortcut to that. So I know that there are lots of these neuromyths and myths out there. I don't personally like to spend too much time on those. I think my job is to translate the stuff that works and not try and dispel all the noise out there. But nevertheless, on the website of my research center, we did, in the end, put together some resources on is this a fact or is it a myth? Like action video games. Do they make kids more violent or not? What is the evidence on that? Sometimes we don't know. We haven't run the studies, but you can sort of put together an evidence base about what's out there. And we did that for some special educational needs as well. So ADHD, autism, hyperactivity deficit, attention deficit disorder. Do you grow out of that, or is it a lifelong condition? You know, what's true, what's not. So I mean, there are go for the authoritative resources and find individuals. Hopefully, there will be organizations that have boiled down the message and the evidence base.
My response to sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Aaron.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Michael. To start off with, to be a little bit provoking, is, has it been tried in the classroom? Did it show to be valid, reliable, credible, or not? Because in education, there's lots of journals, there's lots of writing, not just in neuroscience, but of course in a whole range of things. And the current results show this, and the current results show that, and this says this, and this says that. Okay, with looking at that, all right, has it been tried in a practical environment of learning and teaching? Is it theory that hasn't been tried in a classroom? Is it, as Professor Thomas said, is it theory? Is it an idea that's been tried with a control group? Therefore, how reliable is that? Well, it's credible insofar as the control group has got results which we can use as a resource. But with a classroom of 20 students with differing needs, with them coming into your class with their headspace somewhere else. What did they do on the weekend? What just happened at recess? What's happening now? What happened before? What's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen tonight? Times 20 14-year-olds. I'd be looking at some really reliable evidence that it works, pardon the pun, at the chalk face. It works in the classroom. Otherwise, it's just theory. It needs to have practical application. And practical application means it needs to have been tried. Control groups are great, and I mean, we all use them, of course, but it needs to have also been tried with multiple age students, for example, if it's an idea. So my thinking there would be, okay, the journal example that I've read in this journal sounds great. I love it. Maybe I'll try it. Maybe I'll get a group together to try it, but it needs to be tried, because at the end of the result in the journal, the question I would ask is, okay, according to who? Well, it's according to the person that wrote the article. It's according to the group that did the experiment. That's great. What's the practical application in the classroom? Because that's what teachers are looking for. Teachers are looking for the evidence to show that the ideas are working and are valid and credible for them to try in a classroom.
So thank you so much for your response. My next question is, what are the challenges that you see in terms of driving insights from neuroscience into the classrooms? So what are some of the roadblocks that you see your way? So I think we can have Craig go, and then Professor Michael.
Sure. I think the obstacles are not new, Arian. The obstacles are, first of all, the facilitator, the educator, needs to be willing to investigate the alternatives. I'm not saying it's better, and as Professor Thomas said as well, it might not be better. It's not just like this quick pill to make the brain work, but that educators are willing to try maybe a different approach. They're willing to look at at the chalk face. They're willing to look at their units. They're willing to look at how they teach the units, how they look at the outcomes of the units, at ways whereby they can engage the things I mentioned earlier, the way that they might be able to engage their students, empower their students, again, have the emotional connection with their students, have their students using their imagination, like, again, empowering their learning. I think that's the simple answer. I don't think it's a very complex response from the education perspective. It is, are you willing to yes, do some research, as Professor Thomas said, to look at some alternatives and then try it. Because if you've determined the why you want to give this a go, then that's only the first part. Then you've got to look at the how. And an interesting way of putting it is, in education, particularly in teachers, and I see a few hearts and emojis coming up, we read a lot. We get PD'd a lot. We get different angles from different people a lot. But until we actually look at all that and make the decision to try it in our own classes, it's very valid and very interesting, but it's just rhetoric. Until we actually take it and say, yeah, I'm going to try that. I'm not going to try that. Won't work with my kids. Not going to try that, but I'm going to try this. And then once they try it, it goes beyond theory, it goes beyond resources, it goes beyond rhetoric to actually practical application. It might not work, but don't be afraid. Of course, there's going to be a little bit of anxiety, perhaps. Oh, I don't know about this, the whole thing. Well, give it a go. Because until you've given it a go, you're not going to know if it's going to work.
Thank you for your response. Yeah, my next question is, for a teacher who's very new to the idea of neuroscience, if they have to begin, where do they start from, and how do they navigate? I think Professor Thomas and then Mr. Fullerton.
Did you want me to say anything about barriers to neuroscience getting into the classroom?
I think you can take that question. I think that's interesting.
Okay. Let me do that one, and then what does the beginning the interested teacher do? So some of the barriers are practical in that the teachers are really busy, so they've got to find time somehow for trying out new things. The second is there are some problems in the interface of research and practice, and part of that is the researchers' fault. There just probably are not enough opportunities or structures for teachers to influence the direction of research, so that the neuroscientists are really focusing on the issues that are most important that are facing teachers in the classroom. I think there are some misconceptions there that linger amongst teachers. These are not really the neuromyth type, but maybe of sort of a deeper idea that somehow learning is easy, or that the job of the teacher is to make learning easier for the pupils. So it's that assumption that lies behind people's desire to believe in learning styles, that individuals have a visual, auditory, or kinesthetic preferred way of learning, and if you find out what the style is that an individual prefers, and then you put the material in that style, that they will do better. Now, people will reliably tell you what their preferred learning style is, but there's no evidence whatsoever. There's plenty of evidence against the fact that their outcome is any better when you put the information in a style that someone claims that they prefer. But that's because we're thinking, oh, it's just about making learning easier. If you could just make it really easy for people, then you get better results. But actually, thinking's really hard. And learning happens when you make people think hard. It's difficult and unpleasant. And a lot of what Craig is talking about is, how can you motivate the people to do the hard yards? It's like getting fit, right? It's not easy. Don't get fit by sitting on a sofa and waiting for scientists to come up with a revolution about how to get fit sitting on your sofa. You've got to be motivated to go down the gym, right? So in a sense, I think we need to understand that learning is hard. We can understand what that activities are that will maximize your out. So how to work out down the gym, as it were, the best ways to do that to get fit. What else? I mean, there are details around implementation. There are, even when we have a good insight from how the brain works. So, some of the work we're doing at the moment is about mental effort. So we know that brains are fundamentally lazy. They don't want to work hard. It takes a lot of energy in the prefrontal cortex. They have to pay attention. If there's anything you are going to want to make a brain do regularly, the brain just wants to make it automatic so that it doesn't have to think hard, right? How does the brain make decisions about how hard to try? What are how big a reward does it have to be, and how soon is that reward going to come to make it worthwhile for the brain to pay attention to the dull history class or something like that? Even though history, you've got to know about, right, to understand the future. So there's details that even when you've got an understanding of mechanism, turning it into practical classroom tips that can embed in the existing sort of structures is that has to be worked out. And I guess that the last thing, which is a little bit about when it can go wrong, is that it's really easy to kid yourself about what works in your classroom. It's all of us. When we have an idea about something works, we just go sniffing around for the evidence that will support our idea. Okay, that's the whole point about why we have research, is we need to be careful to have control groups and look for falsification evidence. And so that's one of the reasons there have been fads and fashions in educational techniques, because it's so easy to kid ourselves that something is working when actually there isn't an evidence base for it. So that's one of the things that holds it back, is that we need to get a more critical view into teachers and policymakers alike. So what should the beginner do? So that there are sort of easy to read books out there. Don't go for the basic research, the too technical. Resources out there, YouTube videos. I would start there. An introduction, an overview of the enterprise. That will be one thing. What's going on out there. The other thing would be just to start asking questions about your own practice. So when things work better in the classroom for me, when I get better outcomes, why is that? And how can I then collect some numbers, some evidence that would test my idea? Just to try and start building an idea about being critical about evidence and research and what works. So I'll hand over to Craig anyway.
I think was touched on then was learning styles, and yes, students have got a fairly good idea of what is their learning style, but there's more to it than that, because how do they know what is their learning style? What is their learning style preference? Now, there was, a lot of work many, many years ago in the, let me think, late 80s, 90s, of Howard Gardner from the Harvard Project Zero group, that first coined this whole idea about students learning and having particular learning styles, and then we teach to the learning styles. But I think with the development of neuroscience, in fact, but also the development of education, learning and teaching as we move forward, that's a little bit over. It's still valid, but it's a little bit overemphasized. These days, conversations are more like, all right, let's take preferred learning styles. Now, the IBO took the whole idea, and they have their own learning styles in the IBO curriculum, to which there's several of how students learn, why they learn, how they learn, what they learn. So I think it's one of the many aspects of how a child learns. And as educators, for us to be aware and more aware of what we can do to try to generate and attract their learning styles as a holistic learner, what is their preferred learning styles, the first thing. Then how do we differentiate our own prep to account for the different learning styles? Many students are across various learning styles. I mean, I'm a little bit of kinesthetic in this, and I'm a little bit of auditory in this, and I'm a little bit of visual in this. Yet when you chat with the students about a particular thing that they're engaged with and they're self-motivated, again, intrinsically about, you might think, well, hold on, I didn't think that was your learning style. I thought you were more toward this. So I know that hasn't addressed the question directly, but I think it's just to do with learning styles and the research of 20 years ago compared to the learning styles, if I use the same term, now, and how, I'm not saying students are more complicated, but as educators, we have now resources and more research to help us address 20 independent minds in the classroom beyond just the learning styles. I know that's a very short kind of response, but I think that's something to be quite aware of, which kind of bounces off the neuroscience that both Professor Thomas and I talked about earlier in engaging students, because engagement wasn't really talked a lot about at this time beyond how does the children learn, VAK, and then of course things have progressed since then, and we know now that students and their minds, their brains are very, very busy. And when they come into a classroom, there's a lot of things that are going on beyond just what is my preferred learning style. So I kind of talked around it a little bit, but I just wanted to give that for people for food for thought, Arian.
Right. So thank you, Mr. Fullerton and Professor Thomas. Now we head on to the audience question round. But before that, if Professor Thomas wants to come in, you can. Otherwise, I'm just going to move ahead with the audience round.
Yeah, I'll just add to learning styles that there's a question about whether you can identify categories of learner, discrete categories of learner, and whether that's useful for aligning it with individual instructional techniques. I think we will probably all agree that an individual approach is important. Learners are not the same, but I don't think we have a really deep insight into how you can categorize individuals into groups and tailor instructional techniques. We generally find, I'm not sure that we've got a lot past generalizations, that a multimodal approach tends to be better rather than just offering something in one modality. And that if you're going to personalize your learning, you have to do so towards that individual's current knowledge, current experience, and their ability levels. And we know ability differs. So I think there's a good argument about individualization. I'm not sure that there are strong arguments about learning styles at the moment.
Thank you, Professor Thomas. Now we take on the first question from the audience, and I think the first one is already addressed. So I'm sharing the second one on the screen with you. So this question is by Dwi, and the question is, nowadays the media such as AI, AR, VR are contributing to support teaching learning processes. What do you think about tech? Would it replace the human role in transferring knowledge, or would it not?
I'm happy to jump in there if you like first, Professor Thomas, then you can jump in and as well. Short answer, no. AI and so on can be I'm going to use the example I used at the start of today's conversation. The AI can deliver the mail. The AI can deliver the content. The AI, I'm sure, can generate discussion and conversation. But can the AI bounce off the energy in the room? Can the AI bounce off the direction the conversation wants to go in the room? Right now in technology, perhaps not. It's more that with the personal touch. Thank you for the hearts, by the way. That's nice reassurance. Thumbs up. It's going to always be a personal connection with the student. It's going to be a personal connection with the student's learning, a personal connection with their mind, how they're going, what they're doing. Because what is so exciting about the human mind and the human brain is exactly that. We can think. We have memories. We have prior learnings, which we can draw on, and which might take the conversation off somewhere else. But it's exciting because it's all about the learning, and our role at the end of the day, as I said earlier, is to facilitate that learning, not just to deliver the content.
Thank you. Thank you for your response. I get to hear this question very often: would teachers be replaced? So if we don't take up SEL, maybe, because it just ends up becoming technical. So, Professor Thomas?
Yeah, so, I'm going to answer that a little bit. So I think the pandemic in particular and the lockdowns focused people's attention a lot on how much of teaching could carry on remotely via technology and supported by technology. Now, there were problems around that because not everyone has equal access to technology. And there was some evidence that it was widening inequality between children in their educational outcomes because of their family circumstances. So there were concerns about that. And I think the consensus was pretty much that not a lot of new learning took place remotely, online, amongst children, but you could maintain where they got to, and that there seemed to be a strong age effect in that high school students were better able to deal with the remote nature of learning and to self-organize and so forth, but that primary school children really couldn't replicate the learning experiences in a kind of technological environment. So I think there's been a renewed focus on that. I think you need to be a little bit nuanced in thinking about what technology is going to do for you. First of all, we shouldn't underestimate the amazing additional access to information that technology provides around the world. Rather than just in high-income countries, if you've got a mobile phone and you can access Wikipedia, that's an amazing access to knowledge, whereas previously there might have been bottlenecks on availability of textbooks and so forth. So there is that basic thing. It brings into focus that the kids are going to need new skills in the future because of technology. Some of those we've already talked about being much more critical about the information that they're finding on the internet. Some of it is going to be about social emotional learning and about working with peer groups and through social media and cyberbullying. And these are new challenges that we have to think about, things to be aware of, concerns around mental health, concerns around body image, and these kinds of issues that are raised anew by the technology. I think, teachers, are you going to be replaced? So there are two ways to think about AI in education. One of those is augmenting teaching. So this is getting the technology to do stuff for teachers that will help them. And the more data we have that is rich about how the students are progressing, those don't have to be summative assessments. It can just be any kind of progress that they're making. We can do data mining on them, provided we can get around the ethical issues that we're collecting data on minors. So it has to be anonymized. But the information that can come from that can point teachers towards where they need to intervene and when they need to intervene individual children. So I think that I mean, it doesn't have to be about teaching and learning. It can be social and emotional. This kid is going off the radar. You need to ask what's going on in their family life, these kind of things. So there's an augmenting role of technology, which we have to sort out the ethics. We have to sort about the structures, but I don't think you should be scared of that. It's trying to make your job easier. Can we replace teachers with AI? The answer is, and you may like this, yeah, in really narrow areas that are very boring and you don't like teaching. So AI, these are tend to be called cognitive tutors. They work in very prescribed little aspects like, long division or, technical things where you need to work with equations or something like that, where it's clear what knowledge needs to be acquired. It's very clear if you're making mistakes of a certain sort that you've misunderstood a certain concept, which can then head you off to practice in certain little subdomains. So we can do cognitive tutors for like maths, for some basic reading stuff. But that's really boring for teachers to do, right? You don't want to be, if you've got a program that helps children practice, long division, that's good for you, right? The big problem we've got is that stuff's really boring and it's hard to motivate the kids. I'll finish with another point which came out of the pandemic a little bit. Was there is a glimpse into a future where technology could play a much more important role. And this gets much closer to the type of model that Craig talks about how learning should work. So if you look at kids growing up, they're different now to like when I grew up. The richness of the online games they're playing in 3D rendered environments, in multiplayer environments where they group together to solve problems. And, there are all sorts of spacecraft and motorbikes, who knows what's going on. But kids really love that stuff. They're really motivated by it. Okay. Can you imagine in the future harnessing that curiosity and teamwork and so forth to learn stuff? That requires you to build structured learning environments where children can learn through group work and exploration. And if you can build those environments, take advantage about what we already see kids able to do in their leisure time, the teacher then takes a role as the curator of the learning environment. And they help kids explore and learn through exploration. So I would say we're a long way away from that, and governments can't do that kind of stuff. Teachers can't do that kind of stuff. You need to motivate companies to build those kind of environments. But there may be a glimpse in the future about how learning could be different and a different role for the teachers. But right now, I wouldn't worry about computers taking your jobs.
Okay. Mr. Fullerton?
Thanks. Yes. Thank you, Professor Thomas. Just got me thinking about something, and I'll just jump in with a comment. During the pandemic, I wanted to help teachers, so I put out a webinar. I called it "Teaching Engaging Learning from Behind the Mask." Didn't know how it would go. Well, I got 1,000 people. I had to do it twice. But the whole idea, the whole point of it was that, and it's very relevant to the whole AI thing. Just to leave you with a brief thought. The biggest question from education leaders, from teachers, from parents that joined the call was, Craig, how do we connect? And that's the human factor. That's the engagement with another person. For example, some of the things that came up was, Craig, I'm trying to teach using PPT or Keynote or some kind of a presentation tool, quote, like I would in the classroom, but the students aren't engaged. Of course they're not, because it's like they're watching a lecture on YouTube. No disrespect to anybody. So the thing was, how do I engage with students online? Because they want connection. They want to learn, but they want connection. And that, of all the great questions and the great conversations I had during those webinars, that was the biggest. No, you can't stand in front of a screen and refer to a PowerPoint when you've got young people in front of you necessarily. There's no connection there. Great content, and it's possibly what you would do in a classroom. But in a classroom, if we think about it, we might use a PPT, we might use a keynote, but we're talking to students. We're getting them to bounce back. We're bouncing off the energy in the room. It's a bit hard to do by the screen. So I just wanted to bring that point up because it was relevant to the pandemic, but also relevant to connection. Thanks, Aryan, for the opportunity to do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Fullerton. We'll go to the next question. Again, this is a book recommendation. Here we go. So this is Daniel. She's asking, are there any books of professional development already in place to introduce neuroscience to educators? Okay. Would you recommend a book? Any book that you think Daniel should start with? Professor Thomas?
It's a relatively new area, I think.
Okay.
I was sent some guidance around my privileged participation in this forum, saying I shouldn't be promoting or endorsing any particular product. So I'm reticent to do that. I can, as you can see behind me, quite a lot of books on educational neuroscience. There is a good one somewhere. I will root out in a second and put it in the chat. But if I'm going to promote, I've been working on a book that is coming out in November, I think, which is Educational Neuroscience, the Basics. And it's meant to be as friendly an introduction as you can get. So nothing about how brain scanners work or what neurons do in particular, but lessons in particular for teachers, what teachers can take from that. Yeah, I can put a link up to that into the chat bar if that would be useful. But if you bear with me a second, there are a couple of books, and in fact, I will show up the covers for what you might have a look at.
Now that Professor Thomas has started, I can also mention, again, I'm not promoting anything here, but the way my journey with neuroscience and neuroeducation, I put into a book which has been out there now for a couple of years, and there's a lot of real life examples from the education perspective and from my own journey, and it's divided up into quite easily to understand things like how to, using techniques that like modeling and values based and mindset and things like that. And the name of the book is that I has got that in. It's called Chasing the Dragon's Tail: Finding Passion on Purpose. But there's a lot of neuroeducation, neuroscience content in there of my own journey, and it can be applied to lots of things, not just the classroom. But I only mention that not to self-promote me, but the feedback from educators and that have decided to purchase the book has said it was very useful, not just for their own journey, but also for the journey in the classroom. So if someone's putting it up, if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, it's called Chasing the Dragon's Tail: Finding Passion on Purpose, and very easy to read, and it's got a lot of information in there which would help you in your own journey, but also in your class teaching as well. By yours truly.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we just got lucky with having your books. So I think you should stay in touch with Professor Thomas's social media, Daniel.
Here's one.
Neuroscience
Neuroscience for Teachers. That is by Richard Churches and colleagues. The ABC of learning. 26 top tips with research, and another one of my favorites, How the Brain Learns.
Great book.
So thank you so
much.
much.
Chat bar to work, I can put in a link to ours as well. Thanks.
Sure, Professor Thomas. So I think you can follow Professor Thomas's online profile if you can, so you can get to know when his book releases. In case, Professor, you share it with us, we'll forward the message on the social. I think that should work. I think the next question that we have is, how do we consider or address the impacts of trauma on the brain and its impact on learning as well? This is by Bethany.
Shall I go first?
Sure, Professor.
I mean, that's a big question, and there are different types of trauma, and they have different effects. We can think in one sense of being raised in poor families that are struggling economically, as being a kind of sustained type of trauma, with a constellation of elevated stress, of being raised in environments that sometimes can appear to be more damaging, where there's fewer resources for education and maybe different attitudes to education. And we know that there is an achievement gap in education related to differences in socioeconomic status. So we can think about that as a kind of a accumulated effect on learning, and we can begin to understand some of the ways that we might try and ameliorate that within the school, or how we might be able to help parents alleviate the effects of not having enough books at home, not having enough time at home on children's development. None of that should undermine the general political view that we should reduce inequality and poverty in the first place. But we can also think about trauma in an acute sense as particular events that have happened to children, and the kind of effects that might have on the children's behavior in the class or their emotional state. I think we have to think about, we know, for example, from the neuroscience, that if you teach children stuff, I don't know, the capital cities of the countries of the world, we know that the way the cortex works, the wrinkly part on the outside of the brain, if you don't use knowledge, you forget it, right? But the emotional structures of the brain, the limbic system in particular, that detects fearful or dangerous situations, and it sort of super records memories around them. And that part of the brain doesn't forget. So if you've got a phobia about spiders, that's your amygdala that is like scared of spiders. It doesn't just forget one day that you were scared of spiders. You actually need to overwrite in the amygdala the memories of spiders by being in spider situations and finding out that they're not so bad after all. It's called progressive desensitization. So when you have these traumatic experiences that actually influence the emotion system, you can't just sit there and expect them to dissipate over time. And we know that there's a close interaction between the emotion systems and kind of cognitive control systems. So it'll affect attention, it'll affect concentration, and you'll get elevated levels of aggression as the brain is more stressed by these experiences. So in those situations, you can do short-term amelioration in the classroom by trying to concentrate on emotion regulation techniques. But ultimately, the answers are therapeutic. And you need to take those children out and give them an opportunity to have some kind of therapeutic support around their trauma. So you can get kids in the classroom who misbehave for non-traumatic reasons, right? There are kids who just want to get what they want to get, and they're not bothered about who that's going to upset, and those kids can be disruptive. there is research around those children about what kind of schedules of punishment or reward you can do to get those children to behave better. And most of the research there is suggesting that it's more effective to have sanction-free environments. That these children, you don't improve their behavior by either punishing them or by making them feel guilty that, well, you've let all your friends down. Just doesn't work on those kids. Instead, you need to reward them for positive behaviors that will fit in with the rest of the class. So for that particular group of kids, you need to, in effect, bribe them to behave better for the sake of the whole class. So that's a challenge, because you can have children who are misbehaving in the classroom for different reasons. And you need to understand why those children are misbehaving to know how to respond to that. But in some cases, you do need additional therapeutic support to help the children who have had acute traumatic experiences.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Thomas, for that one. I've just shared one article with all of you here. I remember Dr. Surofi's discussion in one of the panels we had earlier, and she warned the participants to avoid therapeuticizing education. So it's very important to know our limitations as teachers as to what we can or we cannot do within the classroom, because this could be a little bit of a dicey situation. So I hope Professor Thomas's response is helpful, and you also take this idea of not therapeuticizing education, because we don't have the expertise. So there you go. So thank you so much for the question, as well as for the response, Professor Thomas. We move on to the next question now. I think this is a very interesting question. Even I would like to know what neurological technologies are currently available or being explored that can enhance teacher effectiveness or efficiency in addressing learning difficulties? This is the question.
Based on the last question, not so much technology in the tech sense, but to do with trauma, but also to do with this question. That's why I'll just jump in there. Often because of a major event, negative event that has happened with a student, it's sitting back, as Professor Thomas said, sitting in there like the spiders. It's sitting back in the subconscious as a limiting belief. And with all the therapy and the things that are available to students, if it's just a limiting belief that they have, there is actual technologies to do with conversation, to do with coming out of NLP, basically, to be able to help students to move beyond those limiting beliefs, because the subconscious doesn't know right from wrong. The subconscious does what you tell it to do. So the more negative self-talk you've put there, the more it's going to behave that way. The more positive self-talk you've put there, the more positive experiences, the more positive events you have, that's what's going to start to show in your behavior. So it's not technology in the electronic sense. Hope not. I hope those days are gone. But it's to do with having conversations, and there is modalities and techniques, and very safe and very non-invasive and very, very useful techniques that you can talk with students about. Not pretending to be a psychologist, not pretending to be anything else, but just to help them come to terms with what that limiting belief might be and to be able to move beyond it. And often that might just simply be a case of having the student talk about something that they are interested in, having them talk about something that they're really keen on. Maybe they're a great soccer player, and you have them talking about, tell me about soccer, tell me about training the other day, tell me about what you did and how you did it and why you love soccer so much. And from there, you can often move into the behavioral or the limiting belief and kind of get the student to move beyond that. And then that helps them generally in them feeling good about themselves, but in a whole lot of other ways as well. So simple, and effective, non-invasive, and again, it empowers the student because teacher becomes coach, student becomes coachee, student is talking to the teacher in an area that the student is into and positive about, and it can help identify some limiting beliefs. So it's not technology, but it's a very simple conversational technique that can be a linguistic technique, to coin a phrase, that can be used to help students move through things like, that's only one example, like behavioural things or limiting beliefs.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fullerton. Yes, Professor Thomas, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I don't think there are any neurotechnologies in the classroom right now that are going to help teachers and improve pupils' learning outcomes. I just want to say there aren't neurotechnologies. So I think neurotechnologies, brain imaging, and sort of the varieties of that, magnetic resonance imaging and electrophysiology and magnetospectroscopy and all of these different techniques, they are good research tools for figuring out how the brain works in various different contexts, and they all have significant limitations. For example, very hard to see to put a child in a giant brain scanner and expect to understand what goes on in naturalistic learning, for example. But for instance, at my university, we have just started up a toddler lab where we're using the latest wireless brain imaging techniques to allow sort of 4 and 5-year-olds to do naturalistic play while we can record the energy consumption in the different areas of their brain. But it's really kind of cutting edge research to understand how things work. Occasionally you will hear people saying, oh, we can use neurotechnologies for diagnosis to try and help understand whether a child has autism or what your ability is, or are you going to have dyslexia, these kind of things. I don't think the technologies are good enough for that. I think you should just measure behavior. It's more easy to do. It's less expensive. I don't think at the moment neurotechnologies are good enough for diagnosis. There's a similar growth in arguments that we should be using genetics to predict aspects of children's ability that might be useful. Again, I don't think it's powerful enough. It's too expensive. Just see how well kids are doing and use that information to respond accordingly. There is sort of cutting edge work coming out in the area of cognitive enhancement. For example, you can stimulate the brain either using magnetic fields or very weak electrical currents applied directly to the scalp. It's called transcranial direct stimulation. And there is I'm going to say it's a speculation, because no one really knows exactly how this works, that it makes the neurons a little bit more likely to fire. And by doing so, increases the neuroplasticity, the readiness of the brain to change in response to experience. And there are some initial papers popping up here and there showing that some kind of learning outcomes can be better if the last paper I saw was in older adults, and seeing whether you could improve their memory skills by having them learn word lists when their brain was being gently stimulated compared to a control group that wore all the hairnet and everything, the electrodes on their scalp, and it gave you a tingling feeling, but nothing was actually happening. So that was a paper that came out like last week suggesting some positive effects. But, we don't really know exactly how that works. And that's so cutting edge. I can't see that for a long time having any direct translation. It speaks to a bigger picture of cognitive enhancement. What special techniques can we use to make children cleverer? I think most of that work is hoping for a free lunch. that we can, if only everyone learned chess, that will make us all clever. Or if only everyone learned another language, that will make everyone clever. Or, I think these are, it's more hope. We've never demonstrated, whenever you practice one skill, in general, you get better at that skill. There is not, in essence, transfer to general intelligence. The one thing we know for sure improves children's intelligence is education. We know through meta-analyses and reviews that for every additional year of education children complete, their IQ is 1 to 5 IQ points higher, right? But education is practicing everything. And I think that's generally the view that to get cleverer, you need to practice everything. So I wouldn't go in this direction of thinking that neurotechnology is going to be an amazing tool. It could work out that way, but I wouldn't hold your breath.
Thank you so much, Professor Thomas. So I think we've moved towards the end of this discussion. So we have 1 minute each to Professor Thomas and Mr. Fullerton. And I'm going to ask each one of you, if there's, in 1 minute, if you have to share something with the teachers, what would that be? I mean, say in terms of neuroscience, of course, we've covered a lot of myths that were there, especially like one of the most prevalent ones being learning styles. So it was quite interesting. So I think we have answered the question that we had, the impact question. So if you have 1 minute to share some insight or an idea with the educators on how they can move ahead, I think that'd be great help.
I'd like to share a bit of a summary. Be open to maybe getting out of your comfort zone as an educator. Be open to trying new things, not just to help motivate and emotionally have students emotionally invested in what you're doing, but also for you. As Professor Thomas has said a few times in this conversation, we are busy, we are overworked, and all those things. So why not make what we do more fun? Why not take these developments in neuroscience, the things that we've talked about today, not just to share with your students, but to share with yourself? Not just trying to create and encourage holistic learners, but holistic teachers. Teachers that are open-minded, teachers that are willing to try new things, so that you're not getting up Monday morning on the first day of the school year, which has just started, and say, right, here we go again, negative self-talk. Chapter 1, Volume 1 of Teacher-Wise Approach to Learning. It gets old quickly, doesn't it? I know it gets old quickly. So open it up. Take the blinkers off. A racehorse has blinkers on for one purpose, to get from A to B as quick as they can. No distractions, no peripheral vision, no other ideas. Well, don't you have any more ideas, horse? I want you to go from here to here as quick as you can every single time you're on that track. As an educator, take the blinkers off. Wow. What else can I do to encourage, intrinsically motivate me to then help my students and help me have more fun in a very demanding but a very, very fun vocation? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Fullerton. Professor Thomas.
All right, so 1 minute. Couple of summary points. I think be critical about your own practice. Try and think about how to evaluate what is working for you in your own classroom. And the more you think critically about that, the more it'll open your eyes to what researchers are trying to do to find out what works. I gave you a sort of quick overview about what I take from brain function to be relevant for education, that sort of thinking and learning is the brain's fourth priority, that the number 1 sensory motor, number 2 is emotions, number 3 is social, number 4 is learning. There are ways to translate that into what that means in the classroom in order to make sure those top three priorities don't get in the way of learning and support it. So, for example, what does it mean for priority one that it's sensory motor? That means things like embody learning, deal with distractions, so kids are not there's not too much clutter on the walls or noise uh, um, outside the classroom. You need to harness attention so the children are focusing on the area of the room that is relevant to the content you're trying to get across. Be explicit about where the students must focus. Try and control and support where they're paying attention to. And use concrete ideas and concrete examples to build up abstract ideas. Now, that's just translating one of those priorities into what it means for practical aspects in the classroom. But you can do that with all of those four priorities. But then I'm just going to finish by flipping it. I mean, we've gone on and on about children's brains and adult learners' brains. And, what about your brains, right? It's as much about the teacher's brains as well. And I think you can apply those same kind of levels about your own practice and your own brains. So, think about where you stand in the classroom and where, how well lit is it? How well can everyone hear you and see what you're trying to convey? Think about your emotions and your attitudes to the subject matter that you're conveying. We know that children can detect, say this is in the area of maths anxiety, we know that if you're anxious about the content and not confident about it, that the kids pick that up and become anxious about the content themselves, right? Think about the social aspect. What is your engagement with the children? Is it a positive, open environment where they're not going to be socially judged if they make mistakes? We know you learn from making mistakes, right? So you need an error-tolerant environment. And then we can get into details of the cognitive approach. But I would encourage as practitioners, do the metacognition on yourself. What techniques are working for you? What preparation skills are working for you? When does it become easier for you to concentrate on what you're doing? So I think a lot of these principles can apply to the teacher's brains as well as the student brains.
Thank you so much, Professor Thomas. I think there are two amazing things that I could take from the last uh, remarks that both of you made. Holistic teachers. I think it's also a moment for us to recognize that we would not have been here if we did not have some amazing teachers. Especially like with me, when I think about some of the teachers who have been holistic in my life, I think I'm very grateful to have teachers like that. And the second thing was think what works, as Thomas shared. I think that's a beautiful way of figuring things out. It's not just important to look at what's not working and figure out why it's not working, but to see at what's working and figure out how it's working. So it was lovely to hear both of you. It was an amazing experience. Now, I just have a couple of quick points for those who have engaged in the discussion throughout as participants, as attendees. So, as you know, we are moving towards professional unit accreditation that we're trying to do with CEUs. So one of the things that we are looking at is your participation throughout the engagement. So those of you who have had 95% engagement throughout the discussions, if you're present at the discussion, so I think you'd receive your certificates by the end of this week, hopefully, if all tech works in the favor. So now let me formally conclude the discussion. So as you know, this is a moment for us to shape intentional and inclusive policies and nurturing practices towards creating an ecosystem that's truly empathetic, compassionate, mindful, and fosters a space for all teachers and students to grow and thrive. Educators and school leaders, I believe, truly have both the power and potential to affect this positive transformation. I do understand that we still have a lot of questions that we may not have been able to cover or answer sufficiently through this panel discussion. And we look forward to hearing from you your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions towards of neuroscience in education and its impact. Please send me an email or tag us in your post on social media, and I'd be delighted to know more from you. Also, do suggest what you'd like our future discussions to be on. We've Or do not forget to join the global networking at the lounge today, and do check out the booths at the exhibition. We have a couple of exciting projects that you can go have a look at. And all of these are funded projects. So it would be an interesting idea if you can for and be part of it. On behalf of the Global Citizenship Foundation, the Council for Global Citizenship Education, and all our attendees, I extend my deepest gratitude to our panelists for taking out the time from their busy schedules and enriching this discourse through their amazing ideas, insights, and experiences. Also, I thank you for being part of the Education Leadership Forum family and for everything you've been doing to advance this discourse on transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. We really appreciate the time, the insights, and the effort that you all have contributed to driving this extremely crucial and beautiful discussion towards shaping the many futures of education for generations of young people. Please proceed to the lounge for networking event and do expand your reach and network. So see you soon. Until then, take care, stay safe, and spread love and compassion. Our world needs it the most. Thank you.